February 2, 1943, Casarine Pass, Tunisia. The fuel gauge in Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt's command vehicle was nearly depleted as he ascended the ridge overlooking a deserted American supply depot. Commanding the 21st Panzer Division, Hildebrandt lowered his binoculars and squinted at the morning sun, convinced that mirages were playing tricks on his eyes. Spread out before him lay countless rows of fuel drums arranged meticulously in an orderly fashion, glistening like precious gems under the North African sunrise. Hildebrandt's division had been operating on minimal fuel reserves, conserving their last drops when they stumbled upon what the retreating U.S. Second Corps had abandoned during their escape through Casarine Pass. The depot contained 57,000 gallons of fuel, an amount larger than what his entire division typically received from Germany in 2 months. Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, intelligence officer for the Afrika Corps, later documented this event in his memoirs. "We discovered more petrol at one American dump than most German divisions had seen since Elimin. The Americans fled and left behind enough fuel to sustain our entire army for days. What kind of enemy has such abundance that they can afford to abandon it?" This moment at Casarine Pass exposed a harsh reality, far worse than any battlefield loss. The vast material resources possessed by the Americans were evident in their abandoned supplies, which surpassed what the Wehrmacht could supply across the Mediterranean. Although the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions had achieved Germany's most significant tactical victory against American forces in North Africa, capturing materials that temporarily boosted their operational capabilities, this triumph also revealed an unavoidable defeat. The equations of modern warfare were no longer dictated by tactics or bravery, but rather by fuel consumption versus delivery. These numbers told a tale that German battlefield prowess could not alter. By February 1943, the Afrika Corps had honed desert warfare skills through 2 years of campaigns that earned them legendary status under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's leadership. They had forced the British back to Egypt, gained Montgomery's respect, and turned North Africa into a showcase of German tactical superiority. Yet every victory now came with an increasingly desperate calculation. The disparity between fuel needs and available resources was starkly illustrated by detailed logistics reports from late 1942. German-Italian forces in North Africa required 250 tons of supplies each month to sustain their 65 Zaulosen troops, with fuel representing a staggering 17,500 tons or 54% of the total requirements. However, Mediterranean convoys faced severe losses due to Allied interdiction efforts. Malta-based aircraft and submarines were sinking approximately 60 to 70% of Axis supply ships by early 1943. Even when supplies managed to reach African ports, they still needed to cover a distance of 500 kilometers to the front lines, consuming more fuel during transit than was delivered. The desert's voracious demand for fuel surpassed all European estimates. A Panzer division alone required an enormous 350 tons of daily supplies during combat operations, and transporting 1 ton of these supplies to forward positions consumed a staggering 5 tons of fuel in transportation costs alone. Fuel conservation methods became a necessity, with tank crews resorting to techniques that would have been considered outrageous elsewhere. For instance, they coasted down hills with engines turned off, push-started vehicles to save battery power, and meticulously siphoned fuel from damaged vehicles. In January 1943, Rommel acknowledged the dire situation when he stated, "Our operations are dictated more by the patrol gauge than tactical necessities." This was not an exaggeration, but a mathematical reality. At El Alamein, the Afrika Corps had only 3 days of fuel left when Montgomery launched his offensive. By February, despite being closer to supply ports, the situation had deteriorated further. On the morning of February 14, 1943, Field Marshal Rommel and General Hans Jurgen von Arnim coordinated a final, desperate offensive against American forces stationed in central Tunisia, codenamed Operation Fringswind. This assault involved sending General Friedrich von Thommer's 10th Panzer Division and Colonel Hildebrandt's 21st Panzer Division through the Fade Pass towards Sidi Bouzid. It marked the last concentrated armor push by the Afrika Korps as a desperate measure to disrupt Allied preparations before they gained overwhelming material superiority. The attack succeeded in achieving complete tactical surprise, but it was also the final coordinated effort of the Axis powers in North Africa. Over 100 German tanks and assault guns, along with mechanized infantry, overwhelmed positions held by the U.S. 1st Armored Division's Combat Command. The American troops were deployed in isolated hilltops that prevented effective mutual support. Their M3 Grant and Lee tanks, with their high silhouettes and hull-mounted main guns, proved exceptionally vulnerable to the Germans' finely honed combined arms tactics developed over 3 years of combat. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 1st Armored Regiment, suffered significant losses, losing 44 out of 51 tanks in just the initial engagement at Sidi Bouid. The destruction was methodical and devastating. German veterans carried out textbook maneuvers flawlessly, while many American tank crews, often in their first combat experience, charged forward piecemeal into withering fire. Even amidst victory, fuel concerns dominated German strategic thinking. Panzer IV units had to abandon operational vehicles due to running low on fuel. This irony was particularly bitter. They destroyed enemy forces but could not pursue them further or fully capitalize on their victories because of limited fuel supplies. On February 17, 1943, as American forces retreated toward Casarine Pass, they left behind supply depots established according to U.S. Army doctrine that seemed almost fantastical to German quartermasters. The American plan called for one depot every 50 to 100 miles, each stocked with an abundance of supplies sufficient to sustain operations even if others were lost. When the Germans encountered these depots, measuring fuel by the liter and counting artillery rounds meticulously, they found a level of abundance that was beyond their comprehension. A reconnaissance patrol from the 21st Panzer Division discovered one such major depot near Staschen-Dessenid. The patrol leader's report, preserved in German archives, offers insight into the shock and awe experienced by the Germans upon encountering this vast array of supplies. The depot covered approximately 10 hectares, with fuel drums neatly arranged in rows, totaling over 400 barrels, each containing 55 gallons. There were rations for what must have been an entire regiment's needs for a month: fresh white bread, canned meat, real coffee, thousands of cartons of chocolate and cigarettes. Medical supplies not seen since early 1941 completed the picture of American logistical superiority. German soldiers, who had been surviving on a diet of Italian hardack and airsat coffee made from acorns, eagerly devoured the American rations with the desperation of men suffering from starvation. The chocolate alone surpassed what German civilians typically received in their monthly provisions. However, it was the fuel that held the greatest significance. Within hours, vehicles previously declared non-operational due to empty tanks were once again mobile. Between February 1920 and 1943, as German forces advanced through the 2-mile-wide Casarine Pass, they overwhelmed the primary American supply infrastructure supporting corps operations. The spoils of this battle far exceeded their wildest dreams and deepest fears. The material gains were astonishing: 103 tanks, 204 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, 5 hull trucks and other motor vehicles, along with 215 cubic meters, 57,000 gallons of gasoline and lubricants, and 45 tons of ammunition. To put this into perspective, the captured fuel alone equaled nearly a week's supply for the entire Afrika Korps, surpassing what many German divisions had received over an entire quarter. Field Marshal Rommel personally inspected the seized depots on February 21st. His aide at Camp Hedman, Heinter Schmidt, recorded Field Marshal Rommel's reaction for a long moment. He stood silent, surveying the mountains of supplies. Then, quietly, he said, "When our enemy can afford to lose more than we can use, what kind of victory is that?" The captured American vehicles turned out to be even more valuable in the short term than the fuel. According to Wehrmacht records, by February 1943, 85% of Rommel's transport consisted of seized British and American vehicles. The American 2.5-ton trucks, which German troops dubbed Jimmies, were specially prized for their reliability, ease of maintenance, and availability of spare parts that had not been seen in years. The captured supplies not only revealed immense material wealth, but also exposed fundamental differences in military doctrine. As Germans discovered through seized field manuals, American military strategy assumed significant over-provisioning as a form of insurance. German divisions required only 200 tons of supplies per day, whereas American divisions consumed 700 tons daily. This disparity went beyond mere differences in economic capabilities and highlighted fundamentally divergent approaches to warfare. Interrogations of captured American soldiers further underscored this contrast. Captain William Baker from the 1st Armored Division stated that his battalion typically received not just 100% of requested supplies, but also an additional 25% as a safety margin. When German intelligence officers doubted these figures, claiming they were propaganda, Baker simply laughed and explained that such levels were considered minimal standards. Captured requisition forms confirmed supply allocations far exceeding what the Germans could deliver in a month. General Friedrich von Brusch, commander of the 10th Panzer Division, noted in his after-action report, "The enemy operates under principles alien to our understanding. They assume waste is acceptable, plan for excess, and view redundancy as essential. This force does not adhere to traditional European military norms. It is an industrial operation embedded within combat." The German victory at Casarine created a paradox even junior officers could recognize. Seizing American supplies temporarily alleviated immediate shortages and enabled operations otherwise impossible. Yet the sheer abundance of these resources revealed the impracticality of long-term success against such wealth. The psychological impact on German troops was significant. They encountered medical supplies, including penicillin, which was not available even in German military hospitals. Standard rations included chocolate and coffee, while their families back home struggled with meager substitutes like turnips and ersatz products. Perhaps most demoralizing were the documents showing these materials would be replenished within weeks. Shipping manifests indicated this depot was just one of many across the region. A junior officer from the 10th Panzer Division wrote in a letter preserved in family archives, "We feast on American rations while our families go hungry. We burn their fuel as we suffer shortages at home. We have merely scavenged what our adversaries discard, and this cannot be considered true victory." Field Marshal Rommel's perception of American forces underwent a dramatic shift following the Casarine engagement. Initially viewing them as inadequately trained and poorly equipped with subpar tactics, he later revised his opinion upon witnessing their abundant resources. In his February 27 report to OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, which was partially quoted in post-war literature, Rommel wrote, "The Americans are inexperienced militarily, but overwhelmingly powerful in terms of material resources. They learn from their mistakes more effectively than we can afford to. Time is on their side. Each day sees them growing stronger while we grow weaker, irrespective of tactical outcomes." His prediction proved accurate. Although we may win battles individually, the war remains out of reach. The Americans do not triumph through superior tactics, but rather by overwhelming arithmetic advantages. They multiply their supplies, equipment, and attempts relentlessly. We are up against the full industrial might of America. After Casarine, the Africa Corps increasingly relied on captured enemy supplies for sustenance. This dependence led to an operational downward spiral where every advance necessitated seizing more resources, turning tactical maneuvers into desperate scavenger hunts. By March 1943, Wehrmacht records displayed a bizarre mix of equipment, including German crews operating captured Sherman tanks adorned with Wehrmacht insignia and artillery units firing American 105 mm howitzers. Transport divisions operated entirely on commandeered vehicles. The once proud Africa Corps had evolved into what one veteran later described as a parasitic force surviving off enemy surplus, reaching absurd levels of reliance. American tools and spare parts were extensively utilized in German workshops, while medical units depended solely on supplies captured from the United States. Staff vehicles also operated using American fuel because German allocations favored combat vehicles, which became scarce due to production difficulties. Documents seized at Casarine offered German intelligence their first precise understanding of American manufacturing capabilities. The figures revealed within these documents were staggering and hard to grasp. A single report from the Detroit tank arsenal indicated that 350 ESM-4 Sherman tanks had been produced in January 1943 alone, surpassing Germany's total tank production for the quarter. Even more alarming was the trend. American manufacturing output was on an upward trajectory each month, while German production was declining due to Allied bombing and resource scarcity. The numbers were unequivocal and unforgiving. In terms of aircraft production, America manufactured 4,000 units per month compared to Germany's 2,000. For tanks, the figures were 4,000 for America versus 500 for Germany. Vehicle production saw a similar disparity. America produced 50,000 vehicles while Germany managed only 5,000. Major Hermann Kohl, an industrial engineer with the Afrika Korps, analyzed these documents and wrote a report that was subsequently suppressed. His conclusion was stark. We are not fighting against an army, but against the industrial capacity of an entire continent. The ultimate outcome hinged on production statistics rather than battlefield bravery alone. Additionally, the human element made matters even more daunting. The Afrika Korps lost experienced soldiers who could not be quickly replaced, whereas new American troops arrived well-trained and equipped with abundant supplies. Every German tank destroyed meant losing a crew that took years to train, while each American loss was swiftly replaced within weeks. American intelligence intercepted a message revealing that the US was sending replacement personnel to North Africa at a rate of 5,000 per month. In contrast, the Afrika Korps had not received as many as 5,000 replacements since El Alamein. The attrition rates were unyielding and unforgiving, much like supply constraints. The diversity in captured equipment created significant logistical challenges that exacerbated Germany's downfall. American vehicles required parts that German workshops couldn't produce, while the specialized tools needed for captured tanks were unavailable to German crews. The surplus of seized gear turned into a liability as mechanical wear surpassed combat damage. By April 1943, discarded American vehicles littered German positions, not destroyed in battle but rendered immobile due to inadequate maintenance. The Afrika Korps had accumulated more than they could sustain, mirroring the broader trajectory of their North African campaign. Upon Rommel's departure from Tunisia due to illness, General von Arnim took command and inherited a nearly insurmountable predicament. His forces relied heavily on captured materials that couldn't be replenished, operating mainly with supplies from seized American equipment while enduring negligible resupply efforts. The Chief of Staff's evaluation was straightforward. They were fighting on borrowed time and utilizing stolen resources against an adversary with seemingly endless support. It wasn't tactics but arithmetic that would dictate the outcome. Even if every battle were won strategically, Germany could still lose due to logistical deficits alone. As German forces retreated into a shrinking perimeter around Tunis and Bizerte, their reliance on captured American supplies intensified. Units functioned solely on seized materials, leading to an ironic scenario where the Wehrmacht was employing American equipment against its original owners. The final German staff report from April 1943 highlighted the grim reality. They required at least 7,500 tons of monthly supplies for defensive operations but were receiving less than 1,000 tons. American forces were receiving 15,000 tons of supplies daily. The supply advantage ratio was more than 450 to 1. On May 13, 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered alongside all remaining Axis forces in North Africa. Over 275,000 German and Italian troops became prisoners of war. Their capitulation did not stem from superior leadership or courage, but from the overwhelming industrial capacity of their adversaries. Years later, surviving members of the Afrika Korps would come together for reunions to discuss the significance of Casarine. These reflections were documented by historians and offer a clear understanding of the true impact of the captured supplies. Friedrich Schulz, who once commanded a Panzer company, stated in 1985, "We believed we had triumphed at Casarine because we seized control of the pass and secured its resources. In reality, our victory was an illusion, as those supplies demonstrated that the war was already lost for us." When your greatest success involves taking what your opponent is abandoning, you are not winning, you are merely postponing defeat. Wilhelm Hoffmann, a supply officer with the 21st Panzer Division, commented in 1990, "The American fuel we captured held tactical importance but no strategic value. It allowed us to prolong our operations for several more weeks. Yet it also highlighted that while our enemies measured their resources by shiploads, we did so in barrels. We were engaged in a futile struggle against an inexhaustible foe with limited means." The real significance of the Casarine Pass was not found in the tactical discussions among military historians, but rather in the stark numerical reality exposed through the captured supplies. For Germany, monthly fuel allocation stood at 12,000 gallons upon delivery. In contrast, American forces captured 57,000 gallons of fuel at Casarine. Moreover, American monthly shipments to North Africa amounted to 15 million gallons. It took just 2 weeks for the Americans to replace their losses at Casarine, whereas it would have required 6 months for Germany to amass equivalent supplies without interruption. These figures highlighted an inescapable reality that no tactical prowess could alter. The Afrika Korps reached the pinnacle of its tactical success just as it became apparent that strategic defeat was unavoidable. For American forces, the battle at Casarine Pass served as a harsh lesson that spurred rapid advancements. They swiftly replaced ineffective leadership, refined their tactics, and more effectively leveraged their substantial material advantages. Within weeks, they had converted what was initially a setback into a learning opportunity. For the Germans, Casarine underscored the impossibility of overcoming certain obstacles. Although they achieved tactical victories, they simultaneously realized that strategic defeat was inevitable. The captured supplies, 57,000 gallons of fuel, 183 tanks, and vast amounts of food and ammunition, offered fleeting relief but also confirmed their ultimate defeat through a mathematical certainty. Major Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as an intelligence officer throughout the campaign, detailed this experience in his post-war memoir, Panzer Battles, stating, "At Casarine, we learned that the Americans could afford to lose battles, whereas we could not afford to win them. They replenished their losses within weeks, while our victories were impossible to sustain. This was no longer warfare as we knew it. It had become a contest of industrial capacity rather than military skill." The deeper revelation at Casarine was that World War II had transformed into a competition between industrial capabilities instead of tactical acumen. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to European campaigns where operational art could compensate for material disadvantages, found in North Africa that the outcome of battles was increasingly determined by industrial output rather than tactical brilliance. The seized American supplies indicated an industrial production system operating on principles unimaginable to German planners. While Germany aimed at efficiency, America embraced redundancy, whereas Germany conserved resources, America assumed waste, and while Germany calculated minimum requirements, America multiplied everything excessively, a strategy that seemed irrational to the resource-conscious Germans. A logistics manual seized at Casarine revealed that American ammunition expenditures far surpassed those allocated for the entirety of German campaigns. Artillery units were permitted to fire suppressive barrages using more shells than what German forces received for focused engagements, which seemed outrageous to German officers who meticulously hoarded every round. The morale of German troops suffered a greater blow than did their material losses. Soldiers who once believed in German technological supremacy found American equipment not only abundant but often superior. For instance, the Sherman tank, initially ridiculed by German crews, turned out to be more dependable than the German Panzer tanks. Additionally, American radios functioned better than comparable German communication devices. American rations surpassed anything that German soldiers had consumed since before the war. Letters sent home, those that managed to evade censorship and bombing, exposed the extent of demoralization among troops. Soldiers wrote about American chocolate bars that were superior even to what German children received as Christmas gifts. They also described medical supplies that could have saved wounded Germans who perished due to a lack of basic medications. Another observation was the excessive fuel consumption by American forces compared to German allocations. The propaganda ministry eventually ceased attempting to portray North African operations positively. Even Goebbels acknowledged that soldiers who witnessed American abundance were no longer swayed by propaganda alone. As the final perimeter around Tunis tightened in early May 1943, German forces conducted a last assessment of their situation. They found themselves operating almost entirely on captured equipment, burning captured fuel, and firing captured ammunition. The Afrika Korps, which had entered Africa as part of the Wehrmacht's elite, now relied completely on enemy largesse. On May 13, 1943, the surrender was nearly anticlimactic as German forces had run out of fuel, ammunition, food, and hope. They yielded to an opponent who could afford generosity in victory due to industrial production that had ensured their dominance long before the last shot was fired. General Hans Kramer, the last commander of the Afrika Korps, succinctly remarked, "We were outmatched by superior resources." However, this statement understated the actual situation. They were overwhelmed by an adversary who could endure losses Germany couldn't afford and waste supplies Germany struggled to obtain. What took days for the Americans to replace would take months for Germany to produce. The Battle of Casarine Pass went down in American military annals as a defeat that underscored important lessons about combat preparedness and tactical coordination. Within weeks, the U.S. Army began restructuring, introducing new leaders such as George Patton and integrating hard-won insights into force concentration and combined arms tactics. For the Germans who experienced this battle, Casarine held deeper significance. It marked the point where a tactical victory exposed strategic impossibility. The supplies they captured temporarily bolstered their operational capacity, but also highlighted that long-term triumph was unattainable from an industrial standpoint. Surviving veterans who later returned to Germany often reflected on Casarine as the moment they realized defeat was inevitable, not due to immediate battlefield conditions which remained favorable, but because of the stark disparity in industrial capabilities revealed by those captured supplies. In 2003, during the 60th anniversary of the Battle of Casarine Pass, a former German lieutenant who wished to remain anonymous and was the last surviving officer from that battle offered this assessment. They had seized enough fuel to sustain operations for days, sufficient food to enjoy for weeks, and ample ammunition to wage multiple battles. Yet they also captured an understanding. The Americans could afford to lose such quantities without worry, while Germany couldn't obtain similar amounts even with its utmost efforts. This 57,000 gallons of fuel that we seized was both our salvation and our downfall. It saved us temporarily, but also made clear that sustained resistance against American industrial might was futile. We had seen the true extent of American production capabilities and knew that no amount of German bravery could overcome this arithmetic disadvantage. Casarine Pass taught Americans how to fight back and showed us that we were doomed. Both lessons turned out to be accurate, though ours was ultimately decisive. The capture of American supply dumps by Axis forces at Casarine Pass in February 1943 marked the last major German tactical victory in North Africa. Seizing 57,000 gallons of fuel, 183 tanks, 512 vehicles, and vast amounts of supplies allowed temporary continuation of operations that would otherwise have been impossible. Yet within this tactical success lay a strategic disaster. The captured stores revealed an industrial disparity so immense that no amount of operational skill could bridge the gap. German forces found themselves not just battling the US. army but also its factories, farms, and endless production capabilities. The numbers were stark. While German troops rejoiced over capturing 57,000 gallons of fuel, American forces shipped millions monthly to North Africa. While Germans meticulously maintained captured Sherman tanks, America produced one 350 per month. As German soldiers valued captured American rations, the US could produce enough food for entire armies and still have surplus to maintain prices. At Casarine Pass, the Axis won a tactical victory that highlighted their strategic defeat was inevitable. The seizure of supplies demonstrated they couldn't sustain themselves in the long run. In modern industrial warfare, nations with the capacity to afford losing 57,000 gallons of fuel would ultimately triumph over those unable to match such production levels. For Americans, Casarine Pass served as a harsh but necessary lesson that led to rapid improvements and eventual victory. For Germans, it was a stark realization that courage and skill were no match for industrial mathematics. Tactical brilliance could not overcome strategic impossibility, and they faced an opponent whose strength lay in arithmetic rather than battles won or lost. In the end, those 57,000 gallons of captured fuel encapsulated the entire narrative of World War II, how industrial might dictated modern warfare outcomes. The Afrika Korps managed to seize evidence of their own downfall, securing proof of an unattainable reality and achieving a triumph that demonstrated the futility of victory. In the midst of deserted American supply caches scattered across the Tunisian desert, they uncovered irrefutable mathematical evidence certifying the inevitable demise of the Third Reich.